Hello, I'm Jake Leary from Overlooked, a podcast on the Passion Project that each week covers an overlooked movie and brings in a different guest to talk about it. I'm here today to do a special live episode of the show that's going to be slightly different than my usual format. I'm going to do that insufferable thing that YouTubers do where they go through a top 5 list of something, and in this case, my top 5 overlooked movies. Which, in keeping with the show, is very subjective. So there are things on here that you may have heard of, and you may think, wow, that's bad. And I would say, well, I disagree with you, but hey, that's kind of the nature of this show. And you can learn a lot about people by finding out what they like that you didn't. And that's kind of the mini thesis here. So without further ado, let's start. Number 5, I'm going to talk about Short Term 12, a 2013 movie set in a mental health facility. The most notable thing at first glance about this movie is the cast, which is probably the best collection of young actors in anything I've ever seen. And in 2013, it may not seem remarkable, but in 2019, it certainly is. So it stars Brie Larson, John Gallagher Jr., Lakeith Stanfield, who you may have seen in Sorry to Bother You, which is great, and you should also watch. And several others. Rami Malek's in there too. He doesn't say much, but he's there, don't worry. Not wearing fake teeth, thankfully. And it's just a very indie movie, very small, very quiet, but very emotionally resonant, particularly to me as somebody who's gone through a lot of mental health things and finds movies about that subject that handle it well, worth talking about and worth watching. It used to be streaming on Netflix. I'm not sure if it is now, but it's something that is definitely worth checking out. On to the next, number 4, Peter Rabbit. Yes, that Peter Rabbit, that movie that everybody got mad at for making fun of people with allergies in 2018, which, if you go and watch the movie, actually isn't the case. And I actually have a little Peter Rabbit here with me right now. I bought him yesterday. He still smells like Barnes & Noble, and you may think that's weird, and you're probably right, but it's very charming and cute. Peter Rabbit is that kind of CGI plus live action movie meant for kids that reboots a classic children's series of books, in this case, The Adventures of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter. And in a lot of ways, it discards what makes those books good and sweet and fun and introduces a much, I don't want to say grittier, because you can't make Peter Rabbit gritty. That's not possible. But a much more teen-oriented Peter Rabbit, if such a thing is possible. He goes around and pretends to smoke pot and is generally just a little shithead. But there's an interesting dynamic in the middle of that, dealing specifically with guilt and how people who do bad things process it, which again sounds wild for a Peter Rabbit movie, and nobody talks about it, but it is there, and I certainly recommend watching it. I liked it enough to get this stuffed animal, and I don't like paying money for unnecessary things, so take that sincerely. Number 3, in a similar vein, is The Little Prince. And again, very similar to Peter Rabbit, this is an adaptation of a children's book meant for children, but it didn't get a lot of play. I think largely because it diverges from the story somewhat, so it functions as a retelling as opposed to a direct translation, where one of the characters in the book, or in the movie voiced by Jeff Bridges, goes and recounts the story of the Little Prince. And then outside of that narrative frame, there's another story about a girl and Jeff Bridges' character building a relationship over time and dealing with becoming an adult. And it's a movie I watched on my 18th birthday and then read the book the next day on my first day of college. So it was a lot to process at once, a lot to think about as I was moving more towards adulthood. You get to college long enough, you'll learn that you're not really an adult. And you won't be for a long time. We'll make terrible decisions for years to come. But it had a very profound evoked a very profound emotional reaction for me in a way I wasn't really expecting from this movie that got dropped by Paramount when it was released and was kind of unceremoniously dumped onto Netflix in 2016. I liked it enough actually to get it tattooed on my body, and that is as serious a commitment to something as I could possibly imagine. And that's really all I have to say. It's directed by Mark Osborne. He did the good SpongeBob movie. We all like SpongeBob. We're all in that demographic. That should say enough. Number 2 is something that I've actually talked about on this show before, and you can listen to the episode on Passion Project right now. It's Shin Godzilla, the 2016 Godzilla reboot that came out and was so bonkers and weird, I walked out of the theater completely dazed and confused and unsure of what I had just watched, especially as a long-time Godzilla fan who thought he was very familiar with how those movies played out. So in this reboot, it is primarily a movie about bureaucracy and people trying to get things done and not being able to do it. And if that sounds boring for a Godzilla movie, it's not, trust me, but it's also interesting to have such a mellow theme for what is traditionally a very bombastic series. and it stands in stark contrast to the American version, which I think is a little soulless, and this movie has maybe a little bit too much soul. You can watch it on Amazon now, but please, for the love of God, don't watch the dub version because it's just not the same experience, and I hate that I'm that kind of insufferable person who is advocating for that, but here we are. That's all I have to say about it, but again, you can listen to the full episode I did with podcast producer Edward Wilshire on Passion Project right now, and I highly recommend doing so. It's a good time. Woo! That's him in the background, not some random stranger. On to number 1, a movie that came out in 2011 called Hannah. And if you think that name sounds familiar, it's probably because you've been bombarded with Amazon ads on everything you've done about a show of the same name, and it is based on that property. But the original Hannah, starring Saoirse Ronan, who we all know and love if we have good taste, is about a young girl who lives with her father in the woods and has been trained to be some sort of super soldier spy. That part of the movie gets a little murky and is kind of nonsense and I don't care for that much. But the really outstanding part of this is a fairy tale overlay over the entire thing. So while she's going around and beating people up in very cool and creative ways, there's this kind of twisted, surreal fairy tale element that comes in through the music, which is kind of, again, surreal and lilting and strange, and then the characters, who are as archetypical and monstrous as it's possible to be without going into prosthetics and makeup. And again, in case you don't get the point, one of the final shots of the movie is a character walking out of the big bad wolf's mouth. It's very on the nose, but it's cool for an action movie to try to incorporate a more literary element into it and not just be what it is. But alas, now we're getting a Joel Kinnaman reboot, and I don't like him very much. And frankly, I think it's very hard to recapture that kind of magic in something that's just associated or focusing on the action, but here we are. And that's it. Those are the top 5 overlooked movies that come to mind and that I would do on my show if I could, and if I could find anybody who cared about them as much as I do. But nobody does. Nobody likes Peter Rabbit. Nobody talks about Little Prince, and nobody's watched Hannah. Maybe if I can convince at least one other person to do that, I have done my job. You can listen to my podcast on Passion Project. It comes out every 2 weeks on Thursday, if I remember that correctly. I should know this. I've done 4 of them. And other than that, thank you for watching. Hopefully you like my voice enough to come and check me out.